Hey everyone, welcome to Political Capital, your best source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw from the Check News Studios in Victoria. Thank you so much for being here each and every week, whether you're subscribing on the pod feed or on the YouTubes or watching us on the TVs on Check News on Sunday evening. We got a great show for you. I'm going to bring in the panel first. Jillian is away this week, so her replacement, very excited to have on the show, Evan Pivnick, political strategist, former chief of staff to the BC Green Caucus, and now principal at Cascade Strategies. Hello, Evan. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining the pod squad this week with the usual characters. Maclean K, editor-in-chief of the Orca.
Hey, Rob, always a pleasure.
And Katy Merrifield, BC Liberal strategist and vice president at Wellington Advocacy. Hello, Katy.
Hey, Rob. Happy to be here.
Thanks, everybody, for coming here. We got a great show for you. There's a ton on the plate, starting with the state of emergency, which we are now in after weeks of talking about whether or not we should be in one for a wildfire, weeks of bizarre explanations by the provincial government about why we haven't actually declared a state of emergency. Wouldn't make a difference, don't need it, have never used it in the past, isn't being recommended by the nonpartisan firefighting experts. All sorts of excuses have been advanced for the premier and the public safety minister. Maclean, now that we're in one, does that just make it all go away? Is this confusion kind of hanging on the provincial government, or how do you view the situation?
Well, I think the problem the provincial government has is a lot of their explanations they gave, as you noted, were sounded like a lot of well actuallys. And the perception on the ground was that they had convinced themselves that this was a narrative driven by specifically the BC Liberals, but also the BC Greens as well. And so they had kind of convinced themselves, well, this is a fake narrative that's being pushed on us and it doesn't reflect the situation on the ground. And the problem was it did reflect the situation on the ground. States, regional governments, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, all kinds of stakeholders on the ground were pleading with the government to declare a state of emergency. Again, an entire village it was razed, burned to the ground. And so it's not like people were overreacting. And so now the provincial government has a bit of a situation where it has thankfully backtracked, but they had to backtrack.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they viewed it as a political attack of some point, and the problem being that the NDP doesn't have any MLAs in the parts of the province that are most at risk from the wildfires, or if they do, they have very few, and so they saw the Liberals advancing their constituents' message. Katy, I think governments get stuck with that sometimes, where they view a political attack where there may or may not be one. But how do you kind of what's your take on this?
I think there's a few ways that you can look at this delay and calling this state of emergency, from sector-specific concerns to political considerations. As you just noted, on the crass political side, the fires are in the interior. This is a BC Liberal stronghold, not an NDP base of support, with minimal seats to protect or gain. Declaring the emergency after the opposition asked for it simply gives the BC Liberals a political win. That's a bit of a crass way of looking at it. In terms of sector-specific concerns, we know the tourism industry was just hammered due to COVID-19. And so I imagine the government was quite reluctant to declare a state of emergency, knowing that when that had been done in years past, there was a decline in tourism business simultaneously. I think overall the message was understandably quite confusing. It's not really believable to say that a state of emergency would accomplish nothing and then turn around and say it's very necessary to access all relevant resources. I think the government should have been a little less prescriptive, undermining the utility of a state of emergency, especially considering we just went through an 18-month state of emergency for COVID-19. But to cap it off, I want to give kudos to the opposition BC Liberals for keeping the pressure on the government to declare this, and especially MLA Lauren Dirksen. He's a new MLA up in the Caribou, and there was a video of him circulating last week, literally fighting fires in his own community. In his local community just over the last few days. And I didn't see that as a photo op. I saw that as a genuine desire to help.
Mm-hmm. Evan, we've been talking about this for weeks. Do you think the state of emergency makes this issue go away for the government? And if not, what are the risks that are still out there on this file?
Yeah, I was actually quite disappointed to see politics come into the declaring of a state of emergency. And I think there's a hefty blame to go around about letting a tool that allows, suspension of certain civil liberties, that allows incredible access to discretionary spending. I think there's plenty of reasons why we want to use that as the last tool that we escalate to when we've exhausted all other resources. I think there's a really interesting question about, now that we've declared it, what are we now able to do that we weren't able to do previously? If that, if we've reached a threshold that we now need additional resources being able to be brought in, then great. That's a positive result of that pressure. Again, I don't think it's to our benefit that we allow these sorts of emergency responses to get as politicized, whether that's accusing opposition of using it as simply a narrative that they, to shame the government, or opposition calling for something that they have been in government and they know the importance of using these tools maturely and responsibly, and the consequences of using them, that you can't kind of put that toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah, it is too bad. I mean, it's people are losing, their homes and their livelihoods, and they're anxious and they're afraid, and listening to their politicians kick it around as a football doesn't help. But it seemed like, and I don't know if this is true, but it seemed like the government internally was doing something different with how it was declaring the state of emergency this year. It got stuck on some point, and it couldn't really move itself beyond it. It ended up painting itself into the corner, and this idea that we've declared it in previous years, but we never used it. It didn't use the powers. Therefore, what does it even matter if we declare it? And it kind of became this weird argument that I don't think the government couldn't articulate why it was even at this position. And then the Premier and the Solicitor General trying to say, well, we don't have anything to do with this. We just take recommendations from nonpartisan civil servants, as if the cabinet sits there limply, unengaged and unable to do anything with a state of emergency after 16 months of being in one with COVID, where we know it all comes from the cabinet in a state of emergency. So I found this disconnect with government that was very hard to explain and hard to get your head around. And I don't know, I don't think we're going to be talking about this anymore. I think it's done. It's declared, but it just was weird. It was just weird. And I'm not quite sure how we, kind of put it in perspective for people. It seemed like a bun fight about nothing that has taken us nowhere or everywhere, or who knows. But it was odd, I guess. Hopefully we're not talking about it anymore. I agree with you, Evan. The less politics in emergencies, the better. But this was a mess.
Rob,
yes,
I have another point. Like, what I also think is weird is why we aren't using BC's Alert Ready system.
Right.
Like, this is a direct to cell phone message. It also interrupts radio and TV broadcasts. We are the only province that hasn't used this potentially life-saving technology. Alberta has used this 25 times for wildfires. When I was there, we used it for COVID. So I'm really surprised that we're apparently saving it for a tsunami. Like, why? That makes zero sense to me.
That was a report in the Globe and Mail this week that said BC is the only province who hasn't used this interrupting method of communication. So it displaces the radio feed and the TV feed and all the cell phones. You don't have to sign up for it, just boom. And we're not using it. Yeah, that is another weird one. I think the government was embarrassed by that story, and I would expect, based on their statements, they plan on using it. But for whatever reason, maybe it's our preoccupation with the coast that we focus our emergency response on tsunamis rather than wildfires and heat domes and things like that. So that's a great point. I was going to bring that up, but you covered it off. So thank you for that. All right, let's move on. Sorry, Evan, go ahead. Did you have a point?
I was just going to say, I also think, building off Katy's point there, it kind of feeds into the decision to play defense versus play offense about what government is doing on wildfires versus explaining why we aren't doing other things. Why aren't we using these tools? Why hasn't a state of emergency? I think the opportunity and actually what would have been better and continues to be better is to actually state quite aggressively and proudly what you are doing, because it's a scale of fire response we haven't had to do this early in so many places at the levels we're doing it. And hearing on the ground it's a pretty slick operation that's happening. So
yeah, we do have a good experience every year with highly trained professional world-class leading firefighters, and it's a shame that the stumbling politicians take the spotlight away from them sometimes. But hopefully with this state of emergency gone, we can get back to just the idea that we have a nonpartisan firefighting service doing the best it can with whatever it needs to help people, including with that alert system, if we can get it going.
More episodes of Political Capital are available at checknews.ca/podcasts or search Political Capital wherever you listen to podcasts.
Let's move on to our second topic here. Back on politics, NDP strategist and special advisor to the Premier and the campaign director of the last two NDP campaigns, a man you've probably never heard of, but who has a great reach in BC politics the last 5 or 6 years. Bob Dewar has retired. And I know when we talk about political strategists, and present company excluded, the public tends to zone out a little bit. But I want to go around the table and just kind of ask, because this is a partnership between a premier and his top advisor that's kind of reshaped BC politics the last 5 or 6 years. Evan, you were in the Green Caucus when Bob Dewar helped negotiate the CASA agreement, keep it going over the years. What's your how do you explain to people his importance in the last 5 or 6 years of BC politics?
Yeah, I worked quite closely with Bob Dewar through it, and I think his presence every day in the minority government was felt it was very real. I think there's been already articles written about the relationship between the Premier and Bob Dewar and how important that was. I actually think the bigger story around his impact was as an outsider coming in and breaking a certain cultural kind of stasis that had been existing within the BC NDP. You'd had a lot of MLAs that had really professionalized the role of opposition. They knew how to do opposition very well. And they hadn't been able to, over 16 years, get a sufficient number of MLAs elected to form government themselves. And Bob didn't think that was good enough. And I know he was really instrumental in coming from the outside. He didn't accept that the BC NDP should merely be trying to respond to what the Liberals said they were. He wanted them to be something else. You saw that with the platform he helped assemble, the tactical and strategic decisions he made there. He was bolder, he was willing to go further, and he wanted to win. And I think that made all the difference for the BC NDP.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. His being an outsider allowed him to parachute in. He had no baggage. He owed no favors. His only goal was to get Premier Horgan elected. And, the New Democrats are a little bit different than some other parties because they're a long-term social justice movement with a lot of people who've been in the party for a long time. And you do get the impression sometimes they'd rather stick to a particular principle or platform and lose than change and pivot on the fly and win. And Dewar came in, blew that up, started doing things in the election like, scrapping bridge tolls in Metro Vancouver, and within 5 hours wasn't even in the platform. And that, I think that changed the dynamic. And Katy, you were on the other side, watching the NDP kind of shift. And how do you kind of explain the significance of someone like Bob Dewar coming in and changing that party?
Yeah, clearly Bob Dewar deserves a lot of credit. Basis of comparison to the BC Liberals, he's like the Mike McDonald or the Don guy of the left. Credit very well deserved. I could not possibly agree with you guys more on the importance of fresh eyes and a new perspective. Often political parties and their base of support get very tribal, very inward looking. They fear and resent outsiders from other provinces. And I've seen this in both Alberta and British Columbia. And so, as it has been said, he really blew that up because he had no loyalty or baggage with anyone. I think this should be a lesson to all political parties that having new perspectives on old problems can often be a winning strategy. But I also want to highlight a different individual who is responsible for suggesting Dewar in the first place, and that was Marie Delamatia or Delamatia. I'm not sure if
friend
I'm
of the
pronouncing
show.
that correctly. Yes, friend of the show, also known as the Horgan Whisperer. In my view, this woman is exceptional. She is not only responsible for Horgan's incredibly successful image rebrand, but she also suggested Bob Dewar and facilitated the introduction. So, Rob, I think your next article should be on her strategic brilliance.
All right. Well, you are technically my assignment editor. So, yeah, that's
there
good.
You go.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Marie Delamatia, she has a wide reach in the last few years of BC politics as well, but she's still going. And Bob Dewar has retired, gone back to Manitoba, says he doesn't have, at 69 years old, the sort of energy to continue doing those campaigns. So that may be it for him, and makes it kind of noteworthy to sort of, chronicle his time. Maclean, what do you make of this?
Well, it's amazing when you consider the situation currently in BC with the NDP being so ensconced with a big majority that it's only a couple of elections ago, 2013, where they faced an election they expected to win and obviously did not. And they, there was a group formed, I think called Forward BC NDP, which sort of made the explicit point that, we have to change because it's not working. And yet, even then, it took a couple more years before they even started to convince themselves that they could win the next election. There was a perception that nobody wanted the job after Adrian Dix because you were just being set up to fail. And so it's to your points, Evan and Katy, about some of the changes that Bob brought in and some of the fresh perspective, that's what they needed. And that's also a sign of how quickly things can change in politics if you're willing to embrace some new ideas and reflect the things that people are actually talking about on the ground.
One of the other points he made when I was talking to him this week is that, and John Horgan made this point to me as well, that his strategy, Bob Dewar's strategy, was to say, yeah, the NDPs have scored a lot of points in opposition on scandals, triple delete, and all sorts of small little things that they think voters are paying attention to, but they weren't. And that's the way you stay in opposition, is get stuck on little tiny scandals, maybe state of emergency right now, for example, and you fail to see the larger picture, the larger narrative you're supposed to be crafting about things you might not even be talking about, which in this case was Metro Vancouver affordability on all sorts of childcare and housing. So in that, Horgan was telling me how he got refocused in that area and learned to go from the opposition leader on scandals to presenting a vision, which I think is something all oppositions have to wrestle with at some point, that weird transition from the daily accountability to the larger voter appeal kind of thing. So I think that was interesting as well.
More episodes of Political Capital are available at checknews.ca/podcasts or search Political Capital wherever you listen to podcasts.
Speaking of voter appeal, and we're going to go quickly around on this. I think we might take it to the podcast as well because we're running out of time on the show. But I want to talk about voter appeal or lack thereof for the federal Green Party, which continues, much like a clown car exploding in slow motion, to be both disturbing and hilarious to watch the implosion of this party. We talked over the weeks about the beginning of this dispute over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Greens' position and a defection. And we've got to the point now where there is a court battle between the party executives and the leader. Evan, the BC Greens and the federal Greens, just to start this, are not as connected as, say, the NDP. So it's not a reflection on the BC Greens. But, as someone who's worked in the green world in the past, what do you make of what's happening here at the federal party?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway from watching what's happening is you've had a transition from a party that was led by Elizabeth May, who got a name for herself during a conservative government, was seen as a credible critic, and eventually, decided to transition out. And it turned out the party was a collection of different causes that had Elizabeth May in common. And without Elizabeth May, I think you've seen sort of a diffraction of those different pieces. They've started to fight each other, and I don't see what they're for. I don't know what the offer is for voters in an election that might be around the corner. I don't know what place they're looking to play on the landscape as issues become, climate change is effectively moved forward by the Liberals. And I think that loss of that unifying piece with Elizabeth has had a big impact.
Yeah, for sure. She's still there, but not in that role. Katy, in the past, we've discussed on the podcast that we all sort of believe that leader Anna May Paul deserves a chance to take this party through the election. She's the leader. You can't kneecap her now. It's not a fair way to do it. What do you make of what's happening here and now this court battle?
I think this is embarrassing. I think it's ruining a promising and relevant political party's current success and future growth. I think the federal party is clearly being run into the ground by neophyte ideologues with no appreciation for loyalty, political intelligence, or smart strategy. For example, the interim president is a 25-year-old spoken word artist specializing in slam poetry. Perhaps she's not up to the task of managing a federal political party. And frankly, if I were the provincial Greens, I would be doing everything I could to distance myself from the feds in order to avoid any collateral damage of this utter nightmare.
I like the Beaverton article this week that said the Greens threatened to split into the blue and yellow parties. But that was just, we'll edit that joke out because no one laughed. It's fine.
I laughed.
Oh, okay. Good. Maclean, what do you make of all this?
I mean, in just the previous segment, we were talking about some parties would rather feel morally certain and lose than compromise and win. And I think that's what we're seeing here. The Greens seem to be deciding, having a public discussion about whether they'd rather stay at 5% and feel good about feeling certain about some issues like Israel-Palestine, or start to embrace some more nuanced views and, maybe even double their support. And it's unfortunate because you're right. She is a democratically elected leader. To be doing this just before a federal election it's insane. And it's a shame.
We'll come back to the Greens in a minute, I think, in the podcast section, talk a little bit more about this. I want to very, very quickly do our hot take. We only have a minute or so here, so we're just going to go around super quick. Fourth wave appearing in the United States. We have just kind of the Delta variant and things going backwards there, maybe even masks returning. It's possible. What do you think? Are we headed to a fourth wave in British Columbia? And, we'll just leave it at that. Do you think we are going to get a fourth wave in British Columbia, Maclean?
No, I do not. Keep on getting vaccinated.
Okay, Evan.
Yeah, I think too early to say, but vaccinations work and are working. So,
okay, hopefully no. We'll go with hopefully no. Yeah, Katy.
There'll be outbreaks among the unvaccinated, but no, our province is not headed towards a fourth wave.
Yeah, I agree with you all. I just kind of worry. We are not an island. Well, we are literally an island here on Vancouver Island, but what happens in the United States bleeds over here. What happens in Australia, what's happening in the UK, we can't. I think Canada has always had this weird thing during this pandemic that somehow we're different, and we always end up in the same position as the rest of the world eventually, especially with the third wave, and we didn't think we were going to have that. So I am going to buck the trend here and say, yes, we will have a fourth wave with the Delta variant, and I don't know if it's going to lead to a lockdown. But I don't see how we avoid that, even though our vaccination rate is pretty good. That's my negative host take. As the host, I'm allowed to be negative and contradictory. And then,
ironically, you're saying we can't inoculate ourselves against this.
That's right. That's what I'm saying. Just kill Maclean's mic. We're gonna just go. We're gonna blank that feed out for the rest of the show. Actually, we're at the end of the show, so we don't have to do that. All right. Thanks everyone for being here this week. Thank you, Evan, for joining us, and thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe and get the latest on Political Capital. Get a little ding in your inbox there, your pod box, or whatever it is, letting you know the show is here on Friday afternoons, and we will see you next week. Take care.
More episodes of Political Capital are available at checknews.ca/podcasts or search Political Capital wherever you listen to podcasts.